Hi, everybody. We're really excited to present the results of our study Replication. Our group in the Pacific Coast covered the Norman 2008 study on increasing physical activity. So we'll go ahead and start with some introductions of each of our group members, and then we will get right into the results of our study.
Hi, my name is Robin Anderson. I live in Stockton, California. I've been practicing ABA for about 3 or 4 years now. I'm an RBT and a clinical supervisor for a private ABA company.
From Chicago, lived in Washington, Boise, and I'm in Idaho now working as an RBT. And I primarily work with closer to early intervention ages, but I also do elementary school aged children as well.
And I am Julia King-Cohn. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, where I have been practicing specifically in the field of ABA with students with autism for the past 1.5 years, though I've been involved in the special needs community in various ways since I graduated high school in 2011. I went right back to working in the autism program at my high school when I graduated. So I've been involved with this population for a very long time. They're very, very passionate about getting to use ABA at the school that I work at currently, which is a school specifically for kids with autism. I work with 5 students ages 10 to 13. So we've got that awesome preteen and early teen group that we get to hang out with every day. And without any further ado, let's get to our group behavior change project.
All right, so like Julia said, our project was done on the Norman study, done in 2008. And that study really focused on increasing physical activity in its participants. So the intervention that they implemented consisted of self-monitoring, goal setting, and feedback. Those were the 3 tiers used in the intervention. And this was used to increase the daily steps taken in participants. But they also measured the body weight of participants too before they started the study and after, though the primary focus was increasing the physical activity through the steps that they took every day. So participants were asked to record a baseline of their steps, and then each week they would set a goal for themselves and track their own steps using a pedometer that was issued to all of the participants. The study used a multiple baseline and reversal design, and data was recorded with the pedometer, and then participants were weighed before and after the study to assess that body weight change. At the end of the study, they found that the intervention was shown to increase the steps that participants took, but the body weight was found to have no change based on the intervention. So that's the original study that we were trying to replicate. There was a lot of literature that's also been done already on this topic, because a lot of different researchers were really focused on increasing physical activity the past few years. The first study that we're going to talk about was done in 2007. It was done by Bravata, Smith, Spangler, and Sundaram. And they too were focused on an intervention evaluating the association between using pedometers and then health outcomes in physical activity. So this was a systematic review primarily, and they took 26 different studies that had all used a pedometer as a method for increasing daily steps. And they also chose the different studies based on the current health status of the participants. In the Norman study, all of the participants were overweight or obese. In this 2007 study, the participants were all adults that were diagnosed with obesity, diabetes, or hypertension. So at the end of the review, it was found that pedometer use and goal setting among the participants significantly increased their physical activity, or the steps that they took every day, and significantly decreased their body mass index and their blood pressure. So while the Norman study done in 2008 showed no change in body mass index or body weight by the end of the study, this review showed a different angle there, where the studies that they assessed did show a decrease in body weight following the intervention. And the steps increased as well as a result of the pedometer use. The next background study that we're going to talk about was done in 2010. Jackson and Houghton, who were also looking to show that a pedometer-based intervention is useful for managing body mass index and weight, and can be used to increase your daily steps that you take every day. So the participants were placed in groups according to whether they were deemed underweight, a normal weight, or overweight or obese. All the groups showed significant increases in their steps, with those in the normal weight and overweight categories showing the most significant increases. So just like the study done in 2008 by Normand and the systematic conducted in 2007, physical activity was shown to increase as a result of pedometer use.
In 2004, a study was conducted by Van Wormer on self-monitoring and e-counseling. That study consisted of 3 overweight adults, and this study resulted in weight loss as well as increased step counts for all of the participants. In 2009, Pal, Chang, Egger, Binns, and Donovan conducted a study using 2 groups, a control group and a group selected to self-monitor their daily steps using a pedometer. The pedometer group significantly increased their step counts by 36% overall, while the control group's physical activity remained unchanged. Another study that was conducted on the effect of pedometer use is Sharp's 2016 study. The study was done on first-year university students, and that study resulted in an increase in mild physical activity for all of the participants. And this study concluded that more intensive interventions may be required to elicit physical activity behavior change.
I'm now going to go ahead and present both the purpose of the project and our project methods for replication. So there was really 2 parts. There was the purpose of the original study, and then partially also the purpose of our replication that we really came up with. And the purpose of the Norman study was really to see whether that 3-pronged intervention of self-monitoring, goal setting, and feedback could increase the physical activity of healthy adults. As we said in the review, there were several studies that have been done before and since the Norman study that were focused more on pedometer use and different, whether they're tracking BMI or blood pressure or weight. And while weight was measured in the Norman study, the purpose didn't really seem to actually be to help participants lose weight, rather to increase their physical activity given the more sedentary lives that we now tend to live in this society, where we work in offices and sit in desk chairs looking at computers more and more frequently. So we really felt that the replication also shared this purpose, but also, in any group project, especially when you're working in the field of ABA, it was really a good practice in getting to use, our team collaboration skills and being able to really practice getting our feet wet in research and data collection skills so that we could take these, different things that we will need in the field that we practice in to work with our clients and to better serve our clients and the field of ABA in general, because research really helps progress what we do. Next, I will cover the project methods. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is our participants and our settings. You've already met our 3 lovely participants here. But the original study did have 4 participants. Ours was only done with 3 because that's the group we were given. We collected data from the moment we woke up using our pedometers or other step tracking device, which I'll get into when I talk about our the materials we use, and then continued tracking steps throughout the day until everybody went to bed. So whereas some studies had specific sessions throughout the day that they were recording the steps, each session for our participants was an entire 24 or an entire waking period of the day. So whenever we woke up to the time we went to bed. We're all in different states, as we mentioned, but linked together by our Pacific time zones. So for our materials, as I mentioned, we did have different step tracking technology. This was a change from the original Norman study where they all used the new Lifestyles NL2000 pedometer that was issued to them by the researchers. However, just based on the pure availability and the economic practicality, each of us chose to use whatever step tracking device we already had, or whatever was the just most economical option to purchase. Just being grad students, it really made sense to us to go ahead and try to keep the cost of our replication low. Also, as I mentioned in this slide, the original pedometer was actually no longer available, though we did look for it. It was not on Amazon or anywhere else that we could easily access it. So Robin used her Apple Watch, which is obviously a device worn around the wrist. Christina used her iPhone pedometer app, so carrying the iPhone on her person throughout the day. And I wore the Pinko Sport pedometer, which is worn on the hip, which is probably as close to the original study as could be done, that is also where the participants in the Norman Source study wore their pedometer. So the behavior that we were tracking throughout the entire study was increased physical activity measured in the form of steps taken per day. For the purpose of our study, the operational definition of a step is any activity that resulted in a count being recorded and displayed on the pedometer itself. We each used permanent product data in the form of those steps taken per day. That was the only measurement we took from our pedometers. Some of the devices had different capabilities to be able to tell you how many miles we walked a day or how many calories we burned, but the only data that we collected was steps taken per day. And as Christina mentioned, with the original Norman study, it was done with a multiple baseline design across participants and an ABAB reversal design for our baseline and intervention. So during our baseline phases, just as was done in the Norman study, we did not track our step count throughout the day. What we did was essentially mask our steps so that we weren't inclined to, peak and try to increase our steps for the day. We really wanted it to be a true representation of what we're normally doing. in order to have something to go off of for our intervention. So in the original study, they actually used masking tape to cover the pedometers, and then participants went to the lab and gave the pedometers to the researchers who then tracked the data. But given the absence of a lab and researchers, we simply just did not check our progress and did not write down our steps until we got to the very end of our day. Treatment, as covered, was done in a 3-prong intervention. So the first thing that we had to do was at the beginning of each week, we would average the past 7 days of steps taken, and that average of the total number of steps we took each day became our goal for the next week. So next, what we had to do was monitor our progress, which meant that we were able to actually check throughout the day where we were when it came to meeting our goal. So the masking tape was essentially removed, and we could check the progress in order to hopefully increase and meet our goal that we were trying to get to. So the feedback was kind of a fun part of our study, because we just used a group chat feature on our phones to give feedback to one another, because as we said, we didn't have any researchers or a lab to go to. Email, or we would text each other at the end of each day and to say whether or not we had met our goal. The feedback then was similar to what was done in the Norman study, where they would send emails to the participants saying either, great job meeting your goal, good luck tomorrow, or they would, if the participant had not met the goal, they would just, encourage them to, you can do it, try to get there tomorrow, there's always another day, increase your steps. Ours were fun because we could send feedback with things like emojis to encourage each other to do better. So in order to collect our inner observer agreement data, we had to do something a little bit different than the Norman study, just again, because we didn't have experimenters. So in the study, the experimenters reviewed the participant data stored on the pedometers and compared that number to the step counts that the participants had self-recorded. We did not have anybody to report that to, so each day we would record our data in our shared data sheet that we used to collect between all 3 of us, and then also send screenshots of whatever our step collecting device was to each other with we said whether or not we had met our goal. If the pictures matched the number that we had entered into the shared data collection sheet, then it was considered an agreement, and if it did not match, it was a disagreement. Then to calculate that IOA score, we just divided the total number of agreements by the number of disagreements and multiplied by 100 to get a percentage. All of us yielded 100% on our IOA score because we were immediately taking those screenshots by the end of the day and also recording our data almost simultaneously. So there was very little chance that there was going to be any discrepancy between the 2 numbers. To try to maintain treatment integrity, as I had mentioned earlier, we only tracked the steps. So the behavioral definition was increased physical activity in the form of steps taken per day, which was anything that caused a permanent product to be recorded on the pedometer. So that was the only thing that we looked at. It didn't matter how many stories we had climbed or miles we walked or calories we burned. All we cared about was steps. We tried to ensure that data was recorded the same day that it was collected, just so that we didn't have any loss of data or, fabrication because we had forgot and then, just throw a number into the collection sheet to have it done. And we also were really careful to follow the procedures that were laid out by the Norman studies. So particularly in our ABAB design, it was always masking the pedometer during the baseline phases and then going back to that three-prong intervention during the intervention phases. Next, we're all going to go over our results individually, and we're going to start off with Robin.
Okay, so I'm going to discuss with you guys a little bit about my results from our behavior change project. As you can see in the graph, I started with 27 days in baseline just to ensure that I had reached a stable state in responding before moving on to our intervention phase. Throughout the first baseline phase and the next intervention phase, my daily step count was really variable from day to day. As you can see, I'm kind of up and down from day to day. My step counts did not really level out until near the end of the first intervention phase. So you can see when I returned back to baseline, my step count was much more stable than the first time around. And then after returning to the intervention phase, you can see a pretty clear functional relationship between my daily steps and our intervention of goal setting and feedback. So, and then the next slide talks about is a breakdown of my ranges and averages for the 4 phases. My first baseline, as I said, was highly variable, ranging anywhere from 2,220 steps to 8,398 steps, with an average of 400 to 645 steps per day. And then when I went into the first intervention phase, my numbers didn't really vary too much from my initial baseline. As you can see, the numbers are pretty similar. I did end up with a slightly higher average step count during the first intervention. And then the return to baseline and the reintroduction of goal setting is where you can see the most change in my step counts, like right at the very end. So baseline 2, I was averaging 3,297 steps, and during the intervention, my step count was much higher, at an average of 7,180 steps.
All right, now I'm going to talk about my data. So mine was very similar to Robin's, especially at the beginning. As you can see, my baseline phase was a lot shorter than hers. I only did 11 days of baseline before I decided that it was crazy enough that I could move on to the intervention. But it was very up and down, as you can see. And then my intervention phase lasted about 2 or 3 weeks, where I focused on the goal setting, the feedback, and the self-monitoring. And there's a lot of variable responding at the beginning of the intervention phase, but as it goes on, it starts to level out, and you can see that it's steadily increasing. And then we returned to baseline phase again, and it was very variable, but it dropped greatly compared to the intervention phase. So from day 32-ish to day 33-ish, there was a huge drop in those numbers as soon as we removed the goal setting, feedback, and self-monitoring. But then when we returned to the intervention phase again for that final 10 days, it jumped right back up almost exactly where it left off, and it was a lot more stable than the original intervention phase that we did. So the next slide, just like Robin's, talks about my ranges and my averages. So in my first baseline phase, I wasn't quite as variable as Robin was. She went up to like 8,000 steps. My highest was about 4,300, and my lowest was about 2,000. So my average for the baseline 1 was 3,100-ish. Then in the intervention, my range really jumped up, and I could go, I almost went up to about 9,000. I was at 8,500 at one point for the intervention phase, but my average was closer to around 5,000. which compared to 3,100 is a huge increase. Then baseline 2, my steps dropped even further below where they were in the original baseline phase. It went down to about 1,800 and stayed at a max of about the same as baseline 1. But my range, or my average, was at about 3,000 as well. And then from intervention 1 to intervention 2, the range was a lot tighter than it was for the original intervention phase. And there's a huge range for intervention 1, whereas intervention 2, my lowest was 4,500 and my highest was about 6,000, putting my average at about 5,400. So by the time I reached the second intervention phase, my responding was a lot more stable, and you can see a drastic increase between the phases.
Finally, I'll go ahead and present my graphs here. I had a baseline of about 13 days. So that kind of contributes to our multiple baseline. Again, we're looking for stable state responding and kind of got it at the 7 to 12 mark, but continued just a little bit further just because of the variability in that data that we see with just a lot of ups and downs in this general area. Next, when I went into the second intervention, you do see an increase in where those spikes are compared to baseline 1, but again, it's still very variable. There is that sharp decrease that I think almost all of us saw in the second baseline once we were no longer doing that intervention of goal setting, self-monitoring, and feedback, with definitely the farthest drop down at the last few days. Then with a very quick spike back into that intervention. My numbers were the highest throughout the group, just even from the get-go with baseline. My baseline range for the first baseline was between around 3,000 and 11,000, with the average falling at 7,513. With the intervention, I did have about just under a 4,000 step increase in my average. So a decent jump up despite the variability in day-to-day data. Going back to baseline for that second time did lead to still a higher average than my first baseline. However, it was a significant drop back down from the first intervention at 8,276 steps for the average. And finally, back up for the second intervention, where you see that I do have the highest of all of my averages in that second intervention at 11,818 steps as my average count per day. In that second intervention, I did get up to the highest amount of steps that I had throughout the goal setting or throughout the entire study, really, at 16,727. Now, Robin will go ahead and present our conclusions.
Okay, so some conclusions that can be drawn from our behavior change project are that each participant had pretty high variability in the number of steps taken in baseline and the intervention phases. All of us did demonstrate an overall increased step count from baseline to intervention. And based on the data collected from each participant, no real clear functional relationship between the daily steps and the intervention can be determined in the first intervention phase. Two of the participants, myself and Christina, demonstrated a functional relationship between increased daily steps and the interventions of self-monitoring, goal setting, and feedback in the second phase of treatment. The other participant, Julia, who had an overall higher average daily step count than the other participants, saw less dramatic improvements in her step count. The overall conclusion of our behavior change replication is that self-monitoring, goal setting, and feedback could be a pretty effective intervention for those who are not already physically active and who wish to increase their activity levels.
Which kind of leads us perfectly into the social validity survey that was done both in the Norman study and then we replicate it as well. It was done on a Likert scale of 0 to 4 to basically just measure our agreement with different statements about how we felt the different parts of the treatment were effective or not. So individually, was goal setting an effective intervention, was self-monitoring an effective intervention, and was the feedback an effective intervention. Our scores on the Likert scale were very variable, so I'll kind of let everybody give their thoughts on each part of that intervention specifically. For me, self-monitoring is hugely motivating and hugely reinforcing. So I felt personally like that was good enough for me to increase my steps each week of the intervention process. The goal setting also kind of goes hand in hand with self-monitoring. I'm competitive pretty much only with myself, so I was able to, try to beat my average for each week. And then, but the feedback was, I think, because I'm motivated more by just competing with myself, the feedback was fun to text each other each night and say like, hey, I made my goal, or I didn't make my goal. It's the weekend, or, whatever excuse we had. Feedback wasn't a wildly effective intervention for me. Christina will now share her thoughts on the social validity of this survey.
I agree with Julia almost exactly. I thought the self-monitoring and the goal setting part were definitely the most effective aspects of the intervention. I found myself throughout the day checking to see how close I was to my goal for the week. I'm trying to increase my steps if I was really close to that goal or really far away from it, trying to hit those numbers. But I also found that if I was super close to the goal or had already passed it, I stopped working very hard to get those steps in throughout the day. That was kind of the end of the work when that happened. So my thought was that it may be more effective to have the goal setting on its own and then see how self-monitoring or the goal setting are on their own rather than against each other. Because like I said, when I saw that I had reached my goal or was really close to it, my steps virtually stopped for the day. I mean, they went up a little bit more, but that was it. And as for the feedback portion, I agree with Julia too. It was fun, but I was not looking to get my steps in order to get a smiley face emoji from the girls at the end of the day.
Robin?
Oh, I pretty much agree with you guys too. I mean, I was always working to meet my goal. I would look at how many steps and see how many I had left, but I also wasn't really super motivated. Even if I was really far away from my goal, I would kind of just be like, oh well, maybe tomorrow. So I didn't really find the whole thing super motivating. I think that a couple of the studies that we had talked about had kind of said that hey, this is probably a great intervention for somebody who is already internally motivated, but for other people, you need a more intensive intervention. And I think I'm probably definitely one of those people. I need a tangible or peer pressure or, you know, something that's a little bit more intense other than, you know, just kind of competing with myself, I guess. So yeah, that's kind of how I felt about it. But I did see it in like an overall increase in my steps, and that was great. But yeah, I don't think it was the intervention for me necessarily.
And finally, we're going to go ahead and have Robin just present some of the limitations of our replication.
It's actually going to be me.
Yeah,
Sorry.
No problem. I will be presenting some limitations just to wrap up our presentation on the Norman replication. So a major limitation that we pointed out at the beginning of our presentation was that each participant used a different kind of pedometer. While we did try to find the pedometer that they used in the original study, we couldn't find it anywhere, and trying to have a coordinated effort where everybody has the exact same pedometer was not really feasible or realistic when we all live in very different states. And just for ease of access, like Julia said, why not use what we already have available to us? So because we all used a different kind of pedometer, there was no way to control for how the pedometer itself may have presented or provided feedback that we were not providing for each other. Sometimes different pedometer apps or things will like give you a little notification like, hey, you're doing great on your steps, or try to work in some more. I realized that that was a problem with my pedometer app, so after a few days I turned that off, but there was really no way to control for how the pedometers were motivating us as well. And then right along with that is the fact that the accuracy of the pedometers that we used was not looked into prior to choosing, or how accurate the method of using that pedometer really was. So comparing the iPhone app to the Apple Watch to the Pinko pedometer that Julia used, we're not really sure how accurate each of those were, especially compared to each other. Another major limitation that wasn't just a part of our study, but was also a big part of the Norman 2008 study, was that the intervention consisted of 3 different strategies to increase steps. They had the goal setting, the self-monitoring, and the feedback. Because they were all used in conjunction, the effect of just one strategy on increasing the steps was not tested. So we were able to look at our literature review and look at the old studies that had previously been done to kind of gather our own conclusions about how effective each strategy was. But in our current study, there's just no way to prove the efficacy of each of the strategies on their own. And finally, the last limitation is that because the study was so brief and there's no follow-up, we have no idea whether or not the gains that we made are even going to continue long-term. And that's the same for the Norman study. The original intervention was shown to increase the steps, but did the increase in steps continue if the participants continued to use the pedometer and the goal setting?
And one final limitation that was almost a personal limitation. When we started the study, we did all take our weight measurements, just like the original study. None of us had drastic changes, exactly like the original study. For me, the limitation was that I'm pregnant, so mine went up. So it didn't matter how many steps I took per day. There's still something growing inside me that was increasing my weight. So bummer for me, I guess. I mean, it's a good thing for that, you know what I mean? And that actually concludes our study presentation for you guys. We really look forward to hearing your feedback in the discussion board and continuing the conversation there on our replication of the Norman 2008 study. So thank you all very much for watching, and we will see you at the discussion boards.
Thank you.
Thank you.